rolling.
Action.
Do
I gotta do it live.
Over louder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good.
Alright, this is an interview with Joseph Perry. Thank you for joining me today. So we're going to be looking through the Battle of Britain, Reginald Mitchell and the Spitfire. So let's get started. So first thing I want to ask you is, what's the first thing you think about when looking into the Battle of Britain?
I think for me personally, the first thing I would think about when I'm looking at the Battle of Britain, because of the job I do here at the museum, would be the Supermarine Spitfire and the role that played in that battle.
Yeah. So what do you think were the aims for Germany in the Battle of Britain?
I think Germany's main aim in the Battle of Britain was really to disable the RAF, to break Britain's air power, to make an invasion a more sort of credible solution, to make an invasion possible.
Yeah.
So clearly, if Britain had its full support of its fighters and the air power, you're looking at quite serious casualties in trying to land an invasion on the shores of Britain. So I think that was one of their primary aims, was to make an invasion possible if it came to that. But I suspect what German High Command maybe hoped was that by maybe breaking that air superiority and defeating the RAF, it might maybe make Britain think about surrendering before it came to an invasion. So I think they probably had two goals in mind in that, i.e., can we force them to surrender, and if not, can we make an invasion easier to undertake?
Yeah. I guess it for economic reasons as well, to crash Britain's economy, but Germany just couldn't do that really.
Yeah, and I think also the act of taking out RAF forces, gaining air superiority, breaking the morale of the British public would have been an important thing to do as well in regards to maybe swaying support against the war effort in Britain.
Yeah, and as for that, do you reckon it was do you reckon there was any chance for Germany to win the battle at all?
I think there was certainly a chance. I mean, when you look at the numbers involved in terms of enemy aircraft and RAF aircraft, there was a fine line, and there were times where I believe Fighter Command basically had all of their assets committed, and there was really nothing else left in the barrel there was nothing left to scrape in the bottom of that barrel. Everything was committed. So I think it was a fine line, and if a few small things had gone in a different direction, then maybe the battle, would have gone in a different direction.
Yeah. So, how important do you feel it was for Britain to win this battle?
It was certainly an important moment for Britain. You can argue about throughout the Second World War, is there a single turning point which determines the outcome? It's definitely a turning point in the war. I don't know if it's the turning point in the war, but it's certainly an important moment where it forces Germany to change strategy, and gives maybe Britain a kind of some breathing space to regroup and plan the next step. So it definitely was an important moment.
Yeah. I guess it was capable of Germany being capable of defeat, whereas before it was Germany having a lot of success throughout the early stages of the war. When you look at the invasion of Norway, Denmark, and then obviously with Blitzkrieg and all that. So
I think as well with the Battle of Britain, it was a huge morale boost, and the British government certainly used it as a big morale boost. If you think about the war up to that point, things hadn't been going that well in terms of Britain and its allies and their successes. So I think to have something like that to kind of celebrate was a really important kind of propaganda thing to seize and run with. And if you look at how the Battle of Britain is remembered, in Germany and Britain, there's a marked difference. As you might imagine with any battle, the two sides would tend to go away with a very different view of it. But I think the German view even differs in terms of certain dates that they place the battle and things like that, where they see it running from and to. So I think there was an element that this victory was important, but the British government certainly did all they could to really push the importance of that victory and really kind of boost people's morale that this wasn't a losing battle, and that Britain was succeeding in its war aims.
Yeah. So, I guess we've already done that one. So, how disastrous did you see the fighting in France in 1940 before the Battle of Britain took place?
Yeah, obviously the kind of forced withdrawal from France, early in the war was certainly a disappointment, I think, for British forces. And again, it was one of those actions that would have caused a lot of concern back home and, damage morale back at home as well. So it certainly wasn't what anybody wanted. It certainly was a defeat in terms of being forced to retreat in that way. However, you again, with that kind of spin that the government would have put on it at the time, the fact that they're able to evacuate so many people relatively successful from Dunkirk would have been, spun into a win. And interestingly, in regards to things like the Spitfire, there weren't that many Spitfires available during the Dunkirk evacuation and during the battle in France early in the war. And in fact, they weren't allowed to send any Spitfires over to support the troops in France because they were viewed as such a kind of valuable asset, and they didn't want to risk losing any. And it was only when they came to the Dunkirk evacuation that they were allowed to send Spitfires over to support that evacuation. So it certainly wasn't the best start to the war. I think you could safely say that.
Yeah, definitely had to save Spitfires for the right moment.
Exactly.
It's perfect. What do you think was Britain's main goal after the surrender of France?
I guess there's a couple of things really. One is, I guess, to try and hang on, to regroup after that defeat, that disappointment, the loss of France as an ally. Ultimately, in terms of most of France being occupied by Germany, and I guess Britain is also, of course, at this time still looking to its empire. So there's probably a strong focus on keeping the rest of the empire together and supporting the war effort at the same time, because of course Britain is not just fighting war in France. You've got North Africa going on, for example. So there's multiple fronts that the country is concerned about.
Yeah. Which of these aircraft do you believe was better, the Spitfire or the Hurricane?
It's a question that comes up a lot as to whether or not the Spitfire or the Hurricane was the better aircraft, and I think it all depends how you ask the question.
Yeah.
So if you're asking the question of which aircraft for the time was the most modern, which aircraft was faster, more manoeuvrable, capable of being upgraded more readily and easily, then the answer would have to be the Spitfire. It was kind of head and shoulders in most of those areas compared to the Hurricane. But what you have to consider is the context of the Battle of Britain. Spitfires, when they are first introduced, are very difficult to mass produce. They have quite a complicated construction, an all-metal frame, lots of curved metal panels that have to be designed and riveted on. Very difficult to make, and ultimately they did get very good at mass producing Spitfires, but it took them a long time. The Hurricane, by contrast, is less of a modern design for that period. It's using a lot of old, tried and tested construction techniques you might sort of trace back into the 1920s and even before then, in terms of wooden frames. It's not metal clad. You've got kind of coated doped linen covering the frame of the aircraft. So it's a more basic design, but it's easier to build and it's easier to repair. And that's why in the Battle of Britain you've got loads and loads of Hurricanes and a smaller number of Spitfires. And if we just had that small number of Spitfires, then it would have been game over. So you've got to look at it in its historical context and say they both had an important role to play. So historically, we can't discount the Hurricane for those important reasons, because it was the right plane at the right moment.
Yeah, perfect. Do you think people don't take enough notice for the Hurricane compared to the Spitfire?
Yeah, I think the Spitfire obviously became almost the poster child of the Battle of Britain. It was modern, it was elegant, it was streamlined, it really captured people's imagination. You hear stories about German pilots who got shot down and they would claim it had been a Spitfire because that was the more honourable thing to have been shot down by, in their eyes. So it really did kind of capture people's imagination. And again, the Spitfire was used as an icon in propaganda, in fundraising for the war effort and that sort of thing. And all of that helped eclipse the poor Hurricane, which I think does deserve to get, more credit than it's perhaps had, in the years after the war. Though I think in the last decade or so, people have been a bit better at telling the Hurricane story and giving it some of that credit.
If Britain made a peace term with Germany, does it mean that Germany can win the war on the Eastern Front?
Ooh, it's one of those big historical questions which is very hard to answer, isn't it? You know, if Britain had surrendered, could Germany have then diverted resources into the Russian campaign? I mean, at any one time in the East, of course, I think about 2/3 of the German army were fighting the Russians, and of course, ultimately unsuccessfully.
Yeah.
Would more troops have made a difference? Difficult to say. You know, would America have got involved in the war if Britain had surrendered? There's all kinds of unknown questions, I think, which you'd have to kind of answer to know that for certain. It certainly wouldn't have helped the chances of the Allies in defeating Nazi Germany. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah. I guess you could say say if the Battle of Britain didn't happen, like Germany still has that extra aircraft that he didn't lose in the Battle of Britain, so he still use that on the Eastern Front. But yeah, it is a bit of a confusing thing to predict and all that.
Yeah, no, I think it would have made that outcome on the Eastern Front a lot more uncertain for the Russians, and of course it wasn't certain for a long time anyway. But yeah.
Yeah. Why do you think a lot of foreign pilots chose to fight for Britain during the battle instead for the Axis powers?
Well, I guess you have to remember at this time, the British Empire is still an entity, still a thing, and so you've got lots of pilots coming from within the Empire, from around the Commonwealth, to fly in the RAF. So you've got a very diverse range of people, fighting with and for Britain. And I also think, whilst Germany did have its allies around the world, you had the Mussolini regime in Italy and obviously over in Japan, but I think ultimately a lot of the world were looking at what Nazi Germany represented and weren't comfortable with that, and I think that did encourage people, particularly maybe from neutral countries who wanted to do their bit, to come over and help out. One example would be American airmen and women even coming over and supporting the war effort here in the UK before America officially joins the war.
Yeah. Which side do you think had the better odds in the Battle of Britain?
Again, I think it's one of those battles which was very finely poised at certain moments. At certain times the odds were very finely balanced. I think on paper at certain times you might have favoured Germany to win with the numbers of aircraft. But of course it's not just about how many aircraft you have. And I guess the footballing analogy is that we had the home advantage. Because of course by the time you've flown a Messerschmitt over the English Channel, you've probably only got a few minutes of fuel and a few seconds of ammunition before you've got to turn around and go home. So I think fighting it on being a defensive battle helped Britain's odds, shall we say, although at times it was still very, very tight.
Yeah, I guess you could say in the battle, Britain was purely focused on quality instead of quantity.
Yeah, there was definitely an element of, we had some very well-trained pilots, although the training that some of them underwent, you think about the time they spent training compared to an RAF pilot today is a fraction of what people do today. We had some very brave pilots, a very modern, sophisticated aircraft in the Spitfire, and of course developments of things like radar, which were really critical in winning the battle, because it wasn't just about how many guns and planes you have, of all that support on the ground, it's almost the boring bit, but the administration, the planning, the coordination of assets was really important as well, and that's something that Britain did get right.
Yeah. Do you think people today give enough credit to the pilots involved in the Battle of Britain?
I would say so. I think, when people think about the Battle of Britain, they think about the few, Winston Churchill's words, never was so much owed. So I think we do remember the pilots, and their sacrifice and their bravery in doing what they did. Again, at such a young age as well. You're talking about men in their early 20s. And I think a lot of the time, perhaps the people we forget are those people behind the scenes, the ground crew, the people in the planning rooms coordinating the assets. And again, they maybe weren't putting their lives on the line directly, but they were all part of that machine that coordinated to provide an effective air defence. And also, people like the Air Transport Auxiliary, who weren't RAF pilots but were ferrying planes all around the country to deliver them to the squadrons who needed them, for example. So it was really a big machine in which the pilots were part of, and rightly very important we remember them, but also other people who supported them too.
Yeah.
Can we quickly move the lights?
Yeah, it's fine.
For the shot.
Yeah, it's fine.
So that's the right one.
Yeah.
It's alright.
You good?
Just shifts the round that. Or if we do it now. Yeah, slides right, just go one first. Yeah, yeah.
Is that right?
Sorry. Yeah, look in your eyes.
Yeah. Alright. You
Is
ready?
that blind in your ear, okay?
As long as I look that way, I'm alright.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Alright, brilliant.
It'll stop me looking at the camera. So.
Yeah.
Right, so ready? Right. Do you think Winston Churchill was an important leader during this moment in time?
I think so. I think, it's quite hard to deny he was an effective war leader. There are, as history's been revisited, it was clear he was, like most people, was a complicated person. He wasn't without his controversies, looking back. But I think in terms of a war leader and a strong leader at that time, he was certainly, one of the right people for the job. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because I guess you say with like Churchill, yeah, as you said, he's a bit of a complex character. But I feel like throughout history we've always had leaders who were complex figures. You look at people like Abraham Lincoln, Churchill, all them guys, and I feel like sometimes we need a bit of that, to help carry the people throughout hard times. Yeah,
I think Churchill was clearly a strong leader. He was someone who was able to be very inspiring and inspire action, in others, which is important in a war leader. He was someone who was clearly able to take difficult decisions, quickly and decisively when they were needed. The interesting thing, of course, is the post-war election. His government didn't win. They were voted out of power. So he was kind of the great wartime leader, but people weren't convinced about his kind of peacetime leader, what his peacetime leadership might be. But yeah, like I say, as a prime minister for the war years, it's hard to argue that he wasn't effective.
Yeah. Alright, so next we've got Virgil Mitchell.
Great.
That's going to be brilliant. So in your mind, who was Virgil Mitchell?
So Reginald Mitchell was a local man. He was born in Kidsgrove and educated in Longton and Hanley within Stoke-on-Trent. He was born in 1895, so he was born before modern aircraft as we know it were even invented, but nonetheless he became one of the leading aeronautical designers, engineers of his generation. In his lifetime he was best remembered for his development of racing seaplanes, but I guess ultimately he's probably best remembered today as the man who led the design of the Supermarine Spitfire.
Yeah. Where do you think Reginald gathered his interest into planes?
I think you've got to think about the Wright brothers, their first flight, and right at the start of the 20th century. Reginald would have been quite a young boy at that time, probably caught his imagination hearing about that news. Friends at his school commented quite an early stage of his life that he was mad about aeroplanes. So I think the new kind of science and industry of aviation obviously caught his imagination as a young child. Him and his brother used to make model aeroplanes that they'd fly around the garden, and their father was very interested in encouraging them to be practical and hands-on, and I think they even had a workshop in the garden with a lathe and things like that. So, at a very young age, they were encouraged to make things and explore, engineering and design and things like that.
Yeah. So I imagine Reginald and his brother, was his name Eric?
Yeah.
And I imagine they were very close at a very young age.
Yeah, Reginald was quite close to, his whole family, and there's pictures of him coming back to Stoke, after he's had all his success in these Schneider Trophy races and racing seaplanes, and there's pictures of him with his siblings outside the family home, or the old family home, for example. So he clearly kept in touch with his family up here in Staffordshire. Yeah, and he was close to his brother Eric. You know, Eric served in the armed forces during the First World War, and Reginald wrote regular letters back and forth to Eric. Reginald wasn't allowed to join the forces in the First World War because of his engineering skills. He was considered to be more important for the war effort back at home, which I think did upset him a bit. So yeah, like I say, he was very close to Eric, and they wrote together to each other quite a lot.
Yeah. Wow. What kind of a man was Reginald Mitchell?
By all accounts, he could be quite a shy man around people he didn't know. He could be quite quiet. He was one of these people who didn't necessarily jump at a problem head on. You know, he would take time to think about it, to mull it over. He'd bring his team around and get people to come up with suggestions and kind of plan things through. So he was a very capable sort of team player. He could lead a team, you know, develop people, but he could also have a temper. And apparently, you know, if people, he didn't take a lot of nonsense, shall we say.
Yeah.
And there's a story that one of his secretaries kind of knew when not to let people into his office. If he was right in the middle of a problem, he did not want to be disturbed. You know, he could be could have a temper. But overall, he's remembered, like, I think, as being a very, not just a capable designer, but a very capable leader as well. And if he liked you, and you were, you know, weren't going to mess him around or waste his time, then he had a lot of time for you. And you know, he clearly built a very strong team at Supermarine, and you know, he was there throughout his career very successfully.
Yeah, for a leader, like, you need that like balance of like, you know, being, I guess, like sort of like passionate like with others and all that, but what also like being like, you know, to make sure you're not wasting my time. You know, even when he's doing something that he's clearly passionate about.
Yeah. Reginald Mitchell was also, I think, a very modest man. He was awarded the CBE in 1931 for his racing seaplanes, for example. But in all the interviews you read from the time where he's interviewed about his success, one of the things he constantly comes back to is crediting his team and the pilots who were flying the aircraft. You know, he was always, I think, very insistent on sharing the credit around for Supermarine's achievements. So I think he was a modest man. And he was also, you know, very understandably very keen that his team, the whole team, got the credit, you know, not just him himself, although, you know, he was the leader of that team, and it would have been very easy to just sort of, you know, take the glory and enjoy it, you know.
Yeah. Why do you think Reginald was such a successful designer and then engineer?
It's an interesting time to think about how people are getting into airplane design, because if you think about, you know, by the time the First World War breaks out, it's barely been 10 years since the Wright brothers' first flight. The aviation industry is such an infant state. You can't go to university and do a degree in, you know, aerodynamics or aircraft design. So Reginald Mitchell, you know, he was educated here in Stoke-on-Trent. He was good at maths. He was good at geometry and engineering. He did an apprenticeship as an engineer at a place called Kerr Stewart & Co. in Fenton, building steam locomotives. And he spent time on the shop floor, getting greasy, getting dirty, manufacturing things. He really wanted to quit, but his dad wouldn't let him quit. He hated going home grubby and his overalls all greasy, but his dad wouldn't let him. And eventually he gets to move up to the drawing offices where he's actually designing things, and he enjoys that bit a lot more. So when he leaves Stoke-on-Trent to go down to Southampton and join Supermarine Aviation, you know, he's already a very experienced young engineer. He's got those math skills and those drawing skills and those design skills. So to join a industry in its infancy, and Supermarine is quite a small company, so he gets the chance to work in all areas of the business and really learn from all those around him, and he rises through the ranks really quickly. He's like chief designer by 1919, and he goes on to be, you know, one of the technical directors of the company. So I think his why he's such a good designer, I think, is a mixture of his kind of education, what he was able to do here in Stoke, and then the environment at Supermarine, that he was able to kind of soak up all that knowledge from all the people around him.
What do you think was Reginald's best trait?
Reginald Mitchell's best trait, I think, was probably his approach to problems. You know, he would sometimes just lock himself away and focus on that problem. You know, he wasn't someone who let things beat him. He might go away for a day and then come back, go away for the night and think about it, come back in the morning with a solution. He might gather the team around to talk through some options, and then he kind of send everyone away and think it over. But he was someone who I don't think he was fazed by a challenge. You know, he just took it in his stride, he thought about it, he tried things, he made mistakes, he learned from them. And I think one of the dangers of looking back on history and putting people up on a pedestal is that we kind of think they're all these superhuman people who never made mistakes and were perfect at what they did. But the truth is, you know, most great people in history learnt as they went along, and they made mistakes and they got better and they tried and tried. And that's true of Reginald Mitchell. He was a good engineer at the end of the day, and he put all those principles into practice.
Yeah. How much did Reginald contribute the Spitfire towards the upcoming Battle of Britain, do you reckon?
I think in the early 1930s, war was on the horizon. People could, the Nazis came to power. People could see war was definitely a possibility in the near future. And so when the government released a new specification for fighter aircraft and invite people to submit designs for that, clearly Reginald Mitchell had not just the Air Ministry specification in mind, but he would have been well aware that, rumours of war were on the horizon. Aviation's a small world. He's actually in touch with people in German aircraft factories. He knows what's being developed on the continent. He knows that there's some very good designs and very good people over there working on some powerful aircraft. So I think he would have had that all in mind when he was developing the Spitfire. He knew that it would have been put through its paces in combat, and it had to be a very effective aircraft.
Yeah. If Reginald hadn't created the Spitfire, do you reckon could Britain have won the battle? If it was just Hurricanes?
Without the Spitfire, it's hard to see how Britain could have won the Battle of Britain. It gave an edge to our forces which would have otherwise been missing, I think. It's one of those great historical questions. It's hard to say for certain. If we didn't have a Spitfire, would we have had something else instead? We'll never quite know, but I think without the small but significant contingent of Spitfires we had, it would have been an uphill battle.
Yeah, I guess I'd say Britain definitely would have suffered more casualties than they did in the entire war, and we don't know if the battle would have been successful at all, really. What materials did Reginald use to design the Spitfire?
So in designing the Spitfire, Reginald Mitchell created pretty much an all-metal aircraft. So the frame is metal, the skin of the aircraft, as it were, is metal as well. So it's all thin metal panels attached to that frame. That does create some difficulties in manufacture. Some of those panels have some very special curves and shapes put into them to fit over the frame of the aircraft, but it creates a very strong, streamlined aerodynamic plane. And that idea of having an all-metal, streamlined aircraft actually comes out of the flying boat races that he was involved with in the 20s and early 30s. Because you go from having these biplanes made of wood and canvas through to 1931, where the winning aircraft, which is designed by Supermarine and Reginald Mitchell, is a monoplane. It's all metal, and it's got a Rolls-Royce engine. And you can see how this tracks through into the Spitfire design.
Yeah. What kind of a leader was Reginald towards his works, do you think?
He was a fair leader. I think if you didn't know what you were talking about, he didn't have much time for you, and he didn't like time wasters. But I think if he saw something in you, he would look after you. He built a very loyal, hard-working team around him. And I think he was a great motivator of that team. You know, he was able to give them the support when they needed it. He's probably able to kind of persuade them to work harder when he needed them to as well. You know, his temper could be quite hot at times, but he was a very well loved leader as well. And when he unfortunately passed away, only aged 42, there was a great deal of sadness at Supermarine, and most of his workforce attended the funeral. And in fact, he asked for them to be seated at the front at his funeral. That was the regard he held his staff in.
Wow. Because like with Reginald, you wanted like to get like the best out of like the people around him, you know, to produce like the best work they can.
Yeah.
And all that, especially since like there's rumours of a war like breaking out soon, and a lot of the Second World War would be like, a lot of it would be a lot focused on aircraft, a lot of air battles, whereas with World War One you didn't have much air battles.
I think it's fair to say of Reginald Mitchell, he expected kind of best from him. He expected himself to do the best he could, and he expected that of other people as well. And if you didn't demonstrate that to him, he didn't have a lot of time for you. But that's because he had very high standards he was trying to reach. But if you could demonstrate to him that you were as committed as he was, then I think you had his full support, and he would look after you.
Yeah. I've already done that one. What was Reginald's first great achievement, do you believe?
I guess you have to say first great achievement. I guess the first maybe really noteworthy achievement that Reginald Mitchell did was during the 1920s when his aircraft win their first Schneider Trophy contest. So the Schneider Trophy is a contest for racing seaplanes. It was started just before the First World War, but took a break during the First World War. And ultimately, the first country to win it 3 times in a row won the trophy outright. And during the 20s, Reginald Mitchell was able to win, that trophy a number of times for Great Britain, using his seaplane designs. So that's probably the first time he really kind of puts himself on the map as a designer. And ultimately, of course, he does win it 3 times in a row in 1927, 1929 and 1931, and claims the trophy for Britain outright.
Yeah. And could you explain why the Schneider trophy was such a big achievement for Reginald Mitchell?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the Schneider Trophy was designed really to help push aircraft technology forwards. It was started by a French kind of millionaire who was really keen in flying. Of course, back in those days, there weren't many airports and runways, so a lot of planes were seaplanes because lakes and sea were easy places to take off and land from. So that's why it's for racing seaplanes as a competition. And it was a very prestigious award. A lot of countries took it very seriously to enter. There was a lot of rivalry between different nations. Italy were prime competitors, America, France. So the stakes were high. International reputations were at stake, shall we say. And it was almost like the Formula One of its day. It was immensely popular. Huge crowds would come out to watch this thing. So it wasn't just a few very specialist engineers tinkering with their planes and racing each other for their own entertainment. It was a huge sporting event with a lot of international pride at stake. A bit like how important it is, in terms of, say, England doing well at a World Cup. And, if they do well, we'll all be happy. And if they don't do well, there'll be a lot of judgment and disappointment. You can almost look at it the same way for the Schneider Trophy. There's a lot at stake.
Yeah, definitely. What do you think was Reginald's purpose when creating the Spitfire?
So when he was developing the Spitfire, Reginald Mitchell was responding to an Air Ministry specification for a new fighter aircraft that was released in 1931. I don't think he felt that specification was very ambitious. He thought, the top speed was a little bit slow that they were asking for, and he thought he could probably do a little bit better. But his first try at an aircraft that met that specification wasn't successful. The aircraft didn't perform as well in reality as it did on paper. Had lots of problems of cooling, for example, of the engine. And so he went back to the drawing board and he basically ignored the Air Ministry specification and designed his own fighter based on his own specifications, and that ultimately became the Spitfire. So it was started by an Air Ministry request, but really he kind of took it on and made it his own, because, you know, again, his own standards were so high, and he knew what, you know, him and his team were capable of, and that they could do better.
Yeah, like I said, like, it really adds to his like creativity throughout that time.
It's probably worth noting as well that Reginald Mitchell, during the early 30s, was diagnosed with cancer and underwent, you know, some quite serious medical operations and examinations, and was quite a poorly man up to, you know, unfortunately his death in 1937. So I think in designing the Spitfire and other late aircraft in his career, he probably was thinking about, you know, these are going to be some of the last aircraft I ever design, and, you know, can I get the most out of them, you know, and the most of my skills out into these aircraft before it's too late.
Yeah. How do you think Reginald would have seen the Battle of Britain if he had lived through it?
I think that's a hard question to answer in terms of how would Reginald Mitchell have felt about seeing his planes in combat. Clearly he designed a fighter plane. He knew it was going to be a fighter plane, and in fact before he died he'd also worked up plans for a new bomber, a very large bomber. Unfortunately the plans for those that was destroyed during the war on a raid on the Supermarine factory, so the bomber never went into production. But, you know, he was building military aircraft, and he must have known obviously what you do with military aircraft, bombers, fighters. You know, you effectively go into war. Having said that, we know from the Schneider Trophy races he got so worried about the welfare of his pilots in those aircraft. You know, if something went wrong and somebody crashed, he was very hard on himself when accidents occurred. So I think he would have been, the aircraft designer in him would have been pleased that the aircraft performed well and had such great potential throughout the war to be involved. But I think they're kind of in his heart, I think he would have also been quite, like many people, quite horrified at the scale of devastation both to the pilots of the RAF, but also devastation that they were able to deal out as well.
Yeah, great answer. Did Reginald intend for the Spitfire to become a fighter plane?
Yes, the Spitfire was always intended to be a fighter plane. Like I say, the origin of the Spitfire design comes from an Air Ministry specification, because, you know, the government were looking towards the future. They could see a war with Germany might be brewing in the future, and they knew that the current kind of stock of RAF planes weren't particularly modern, and maybe needed some investment. And so they put out this specification, and the Spitfire was one of the results of that. The Hurricane actually was also a result of that same specification too.
Do you think Reginald is given enough credit from today's generation for his work?
It's hard to say. I think in terms of credit for Reginald Mitchell, I think we're quite good in Stoke-on-Trent at celebrating what he does. You know, we've clearly got a few things named after him in the city. We've got the Spitfire here at the Potteries Museum, which is in essence commemorates his success and his link to Stoke-on-Trent. So I think in certain places and in certain circles he is well remembered, but I'm sure, you know, we can do more to remember him, his contribution, and that of his, you know, his team as well.
So I'll leave that one for last. Alright, so as for this one's for the Spitfire now. So what were the great qualities of the Spitfire?
The Spitfire was very aerodynamic. It had those wonderfully large elliptical wings, which made it very manoeuvrable in the air. It gave it great lift, and those wings were also very thin. So you had a very large wing, but it wasn't that heavy. That really helped the aircraft perform well. It also meant you could cram in lots of machine guns and cannons in the, you know, as the armaments developed as well. The Spitfire was also very fast, It had a very reliable engine in the Rolls-Royce Merlin. It was capable of sort of going toe-to-toe with Germany's Messerschmitt Bf 109, and the two were relatively evenly matched for a long time. And so without an aircraft that could compete with a Messerschmitt, we would have been in trouble. But I think one of the greatest assets that the Spitfire sort of provides is its capability to be developed. The Spitfire went through 24 different marks between 1938 and into the late 1940s to post-war period. And that's not including Seafires, which were made for aircraft carriers. So it was an aircraft that was able to evolve and develop to many different jobs within the RAF and within the theatre of war. So for that reason, I think it was probably one of the most successful aircrafts of its generation. And I think it was one of the only Allied aircraft that was being built before, during and after the Second World War. So it stayed in production for quite a long time.
Yeah. How much did the Spitfire revolutionise fighter planes as a whole?
I think the Spitfire was a revolutionary design. Clearly there's lots of other great aircraft designs we remember from the Second World War. The Spitfire is not alone in that, but its all-metal body, its streamlined design, the elliptical wings, something about the Spitfire kind of brings together the idea of something that looks great and something that performs great and puts them both in the same package. And I think Reginald Mitchell's quoted as saying, if it looks right, it will be right. And that's definitely true of the Spitfire. It was kind of able to, just the look of it seemed to excite people and capture people's imagination. And when the prototype was being wheeled out, in 1936, crowds would gather to see this aircraft, which looked, very different from other aircraft, around that the RAF were using at that time.
Yeah, definitely. Why do you think the Spitfire tends to have more recognition than the Hurricane, do you think?
The Spitfire is often remembered at the Hurricane's expense. I think generally because, it was in service longer. The Hurricane wasn't as developed, it wasn't upgraded as much as the Spitfire was. And so, by the end of the Second World War, Spitfires have kind of taken over as the main fighter in the RAF, and Hurricanes have been relegated a little bit, shall we say, because it was just possible to keep Spitfires competitive with enemy aircraft. It was much harder to do that with the Hurricane. But I think also added to that is the fact that Spitfires became the poster child of the RAF and a lot of British propaganda. And so a lot of people immediately think Battle of Britain, Spitfire.
Yeah.
And that's because of, goes back right to the war with kind of poster campaigns and fundraising campaigns. The Spitfire was front and centre. And all that, unfortunately, did kind of push the poor Hurricane off to one side.
Yeah, because like with the Spitfire, it was the aircraft needed, since Germany was, I guess you say, forced to be reckoned with, especially with its aircraft and all that, and they really needed to produce an aircraft that was just as good, if not better than Luftwaffe.
Yeah, I think the Hurricane was a great aircraft for a very particular moment, but objectively, the Spitfire was a more advanced aircraft than the Hurricane. But that's not to say the Hurricane wasn't important at the time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. How did the Spitfire change over the years?
Spitfire changed dramatically from when it first went into production in 1938 through to the late 40s when they were still being built. For example, the Mark I Spitfire has 4 303 gauge machine guns in each wing. Later they introduced larger cannons into the wings that did a lot more damage, particularly against heavily armoured bombers. Small machine gun rounds weren't very effective, but cannon shells were. The engine was upgraded many times in the Spitfire. Famously, you have the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, later upgraded to the Rolls-Royce Griffin engine. And if you compare the first Mark of Spitfire to the last, the Mark 24 Spitfire weighs almost twice as much and is 100 miles an hour faster. So it's carrying more gear, bigger engine, more weapons. Later Spitfires could carry bombs under the wings, under the fuselage as fighter bombers. They changed the shape of the wings if they're flying low altitude or high altitude.
Yeah.
You had photo reconnaissance Spitfires that had no weapons at all, and they had extra fuel tanks in the wings. And they could fly over enemy lines and take photographs, for example. And there was even some Spitfires which were jokingly modified to carry beer kegs. After the D-Day landings, they actually had some Spitfires that were modified to carry kegs of beer over the channel and land them with troops. So all kinds of modifications. But like I say, the fact it could be developed and improved so much, I think, was testament to that original great design by Reginald Mitchell.
Yeah. Everybody else. Why were there more Hurricanes made compared to the Spitfire?
At the time of the Battle of Britain, there were a lot more Hurricanes available than Spitfires. Ultimately, more than 20,000 Spitfires were produced, and there were probably more Spitfires built than Hurricanes altogether. But in the Battle of Britain, Spitfires were in the minority, and that's because Hurricanes, you were being made out of wood and doped linen stretched over the frames, much easier to build, much easier to repair. The Spitfire was an all-metal construction, and some of those curved panels, countersunk rivets to make it all streamlined, they looked very pretty, they made it very strong, very streamlined, but it was a pain to build, and it took a long time to get good at building Spitfires quickly.
Yeah, because like with the Hurricane, it's easier to build because the materials used, like you just said, with wood and all that. Whereas with Spitfire, has more, I guess, complex materials.
Yeah, it's definitely more complex to put together. You need very specialist moulding, and to shape all those panels. Everything's got to be riveted in place. It's a lot more of a time-consuming process. Eventually, they were able to build very effective production lines, but it did take time.
Yeah. Could the Battle of Britain... Oh no, we've already done that one, sorry. On a scale from 1 to 10, how lucky would you say we were to have Reginald Mitchell design such an iconic plane?
Oh gosh, what a question. In terms of how important is the Spitfire as a military aircraft, you've got to give it a 10 in terms of its impact and its legacy as an aircraft. Was it luck that Reginald Mitchell designed the Spitfire? I don't know. He was clearly in the right place at the right time. So I guess we do have to consider ourselves quite lucky that he was able to design the Spitfire successfully, before his death, to battle through that cancer long enough to produce that design and to hand that design over to a team that he'd built. So I guess we are lucky that all those forces came into play at the same time and produced the Spitfire that we still remember today.
Definitely. What is your favourite thing about the Spitfire?
I think my favourite thing about the Spitfire is possibly what it's evolved to represent today, because we have to remember the pilots that flew those aircraft and Hurricanes. We have to remember their bravery, their service, their sacrifice to very directly defend our country, and that's something we should never forget. But I think at the same time, the Spitfire offers us a great chance to step back, to try and maybe strip away the guns and the violence, and ask young people today what makes a great design, what makes this a fantastic aircraft, and maybe to inspire new generations into science and engineering and design, and to as a great basis to learn those fundamentals. And maybe there's a positive thing we can take out of the Spitfire beyond the death and destruction. It is about good engineering and education, and hopefully that's something we can sort of push into the future and keep going.
Definitely. And final question: how would you want Reginald Mitchell to be remembered throughout history?
I would like us to remember Reginald Mitchell as, to some extent, an ordinary man, because I think that's useful. Because when we look at people today who, when we're looking back into the past at great people, it's easy to say, well, he's a genius. I can't design anything like him. I'm not a genius. But he was obviously a clever, gifted man. Did well at school, applied himself, but he was a normal person like you or me, and he designed things. Sometimes they went well, sometimes they didn't. He learned from his mistakes. We did new designs, and I think it's important that we remember people as being human beings who are fallible like us. But I think it also helps us to aspire to be like them. It's not some unattainable goal to be an engineering successful engineer like Reginald Mitchell. And lots of young people today should just look at his story and go, well, if he can do it, I can do it too. Hopefully that's what people do. They're inspired by him and not sort of intimidated by his success, but more inspired to match his success. And I think that's how we should remember him.
Yeah. Well, that's it. That's the take.
Lovely. Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Thank you